is it that we love destruction at times even when it increases our improbabilities of existence? Why do we love watching disaster compilation videos on YouTube? Why do people love playing video games and find satisfaction in destruction? Well, today's video I will be using some Freudian psychoanalysis and mostly talk about what he called as the death drive. Like everything that exists, Freud saw two opposing poles within the psyche of man, what he called the life instinct and the death instinct. Just like the metaphysical existence of Apollo and Dionysus from my last video, Freud also referred these two existing instincts in relation to Greek gods, such as Eros and Thanatos. In Freud's model, Eros is life instinct and Thanatos is death instinct. Human behaviours such as aggression, war, or anything which manufactures towards death is from the death instinct. Freud saw that the death instinct was tied with the life instinct in a strange way. For example, how people with repressed traumatic experiences would have the tendency to repeat such said material in a contemporary manner than to just leave it in the past. Why did young men during wartime have the urge to sign up for the army? Even boys underage would do so with pleasure. What explains the pleasure gained from masochistic behaviour? All of these questions raise interest in how the death drive works, and why is such a thing so powerful in the human condition. But I want to relate this to something of epiphenomena in the 21st century, and that is video games. The desire and success in video games can be seen in the desire and want for archetypal and mythological roleplay without having to get up from your own arse, but also in the strange fascination for wanting to participate in a virtual process of destruction and killing. GTA 5 is one of the most successful video games ever created, and yet it is the most controversial around the world, with many countries banning it as it requires a love in digital violence, death and destruction. Yet on the other hand, you have Mario, Nintendo and the infamous Wii Sports as other extremely successful games which are the complete opposite. Wii Sports is like the Eros equivalent of Thanatos, a game which relies on cooperation for its global success, just like Apollo and Dionysus. A digital war in the gaming world between Eros and Thanatos plays on. A form or some kind of desensitization is at the heart of video games to a large extent with young impressionable minds, replacing morally unacceptable violence with reward. But like the death instinct, we are not exactly embodying motions of physical death and destruction in the real world when playing these games. We are instead sublimating the death drive and enjoying the process in the paradox of both Eros and Thanatos, finding the process pleasurable, and this is because we are basically injecting or teleporting our will to power into these games, into the non-judging digital matrix which acts as a good sublimation for violence and other intentions. The reason why pleasure is associated with violence is because of the game's traditionally amoral landscape in relation to what is good and evil, combined with our own will to live, which is given to everything that exists and continues to breed in the world. Fusing these two existences of will and amoral landscape, violence loses its meaning in the game when it doesn't hold a traditionally moral position between good and evil, and is replaced with a master morality of power, in a Nietzschean sense. The egoism of man's intentions, power, or of self-interest come to fruition, I guess, when placed in a digital fiction where the metaphysic of inflicted violence reciprocates with objective reward. It is traditionally amoral because questions of right or wrong do not come into the functions of the game itself. Therefore, like Nietzsche's master morality, if it brings one more power, it is good, as you will be rewarded. But you might say in response, well, you are trivializing human nature. We are not just egoists. We are not just egoists. That is a nihilistic approach on morality. Well, to diverge a bit, I would say that we are altruistic egoists. A bit of both. We live in groups. We are social animals. 2021 will probably sadly be a year of tribalism, division, and of proclaimed barbarianism from the shouts of the opposing poles. Altruistic egoism would, I presume, feature a subjective, moral interpretation of morality which would be associated to that group or culture. So the death drive for individuals is, and can be, obviously not completely, but can be sublimated into video games. Thus, Thanatos and Eros can be combined to produce, paradoxically, a pleasurable outlet for digital violence, which obviously has some kind of threshold but also acts for sublimation. An article by Philosophical Investigations writes the following: Freud considered that the life instinct and the death instinct fused together in early life stages, and emphasized that the death drive was silently driving individuals towards death, and that only through the activity of the life instinct was this death-like force projected outwards and appeared as destructive impulses directed against objects in the outside world. Freud named the outward directed death drive the destructive instinct. End quote. The destructive instinct can then be placed within the desire of playing video games, and why we find violence pleasurable through such games is used as a means of sublimation. If you didn't have video games of this nature, you would probably have more violence in the real world, but that in no way means that violent games categorically curb the enthusiasm for violence in the real world. It just acts to a certain degree as an opportunative vessel for sublimation, which, as I said, has a threshold. Due to this, I would expect a much lesser amount of boys and men wanting to sign up to the army or to war like they did in the early 20th century, because the death instinct, unless it is to be against one's own life, can now be transmutated in some form or way into a more acceptable form of projection. Due to the existence of the life instinct, can the death instinct project itself outwards, using Eros as a racing horse, which is actually an example Freud gives of how the ego, which in his example is the jockey, rides and tries to control the racing horse, which is the id, and is, of course, much more powerful than him. It is no surprise why GTA 5 is the most successful RPG game ever made, when it is based on materialism, which is the precipice of contemporary Western society, and which also enwraps many of the materialistic demands of Western modern man. We can look at examples of nature which represent Schopenhauer's will to live, but we can also look at our outcomes within video games to do the same thing. All that exists is the will to live, the will to power. Such powers are amoral forces in nature, and video games offer the chance for those powers to be expressed without real-world feedback, with regards to our civil social conventions. Therefore, I don't exactly see why these video games are deemed so bad by so many. I only think that they are when being played by young, impressionable minds, who in development may conjoin the digital matrix and the real world as two of the same things. In relation to other things in life, irrelevant of age, people already do commit to the submersion of the real and the digital, which becomes a detriment to themselves. Video games, on the other hand, offer some kind of strange death drive sublimation, which at the same time combines with the pleasures of Eros to produce what you could call a pervertedly fun and pleasurable world of digital violence, which doesn't require responsibility and doesn't even exist. The drive of the superego in such a state becomes non-existent, as all social barriers become emptied. The game itself becomes a hybrid of psychic projections in a world that doesn't exist as our own. Death instinct aligned with the pleasure principle in a paradox of making violence and death a playful activity, a sort of death instinct catharsis, or making a yet paradoxical but symbiotic state of the life and death instinct together via acting out video game violence. I guess a comical Marxist critique could be something like, violent video games are produced and manufactured by the ruling state to act as a sublimation and or catharsis for the death drive, so that the people do not manifest such said drives against the ruling state bourgeoisie who control the means of production. Jokes aside, if the death instinct is there, it will always manifest in some way or another in the real world if it is repressed, either upon one's life or externally. Video games, in my view, just work as a possible outlet. The modern philosopher Zizek talks about an idea called objective violence. Thus, a reason why we like watching video compilations of car crashes or of natural objective violence is because it is of the natural state of life which produces it, or because it is happening due to the state in which we have caused through civilization on a common basis, which we have accepted as the social norm. A kind of inevitability. It exists objectively, therefore it is more fascinating than gruesome, more comedy than tragedy. Thus, our attention is taken away towards the physical than to the mental, which would be the opposite of what the effects of subjective violence produce. You could even give a Jungian interpretation for understanding a reason for video game addiction by the mere fact that it is bad to digitally play out archetypal roles in video games as a replacement for the real world and not allowing your own journey to play out, if you will. Like playing the archetypal figure of the hero, which is the character in most games, and other hero-based mythology games that follow a masculine motif. If you don't integrate that aspect, then the addiction may be rooted in the unconscious expression of those desires which you have not made conscious in your own real world. Just like the video I did on porn addiction, it's the same with video game addiction, but the desires are inverted. Some sort of digital hero myth devours the individual who is addicted to the game, or a set of games, a bit like Cronus, the dark father who devours his own children to prevent the prophecy of them overcoming him. No different from how video game addiction is among young teenagers, mostly before they develop into personalities, let's say. Cronus is just like these hero characters in games for the addict because it devours them into this digital time warp of fantasy, where they spend all their time and don't develop themselves. And Cronus is a god that resembles time and the ages, and this was during when time itself was viewed as a destructive and devouring force. Understanding why we have this death instinct, as Freud terms it, is tricky to understand, but it is just part of our nature. It is as if there is an instinct of nature which is a drive within us, calling us back to the Chthonian underworld. Freud says that it is to go back to being the inorganic matter from which we came from, the desire in doing, seeing and being that which was once again in original state of all things. The existence of an innate drive that produces a balance in destructive force is present, because in many countries during wartime suicide rates drop. When there are low homicides in that country, suicide rates increase, which is very strange. And in the past year, suicide rates have increased horribly. The energies of Thanatos, or whatever the hell they are, took many people last year. Even the voice of extreme depression may even come from the death drive itself. Hopefully this video can give some understanding and that we bring back the life force which we so desperately need this year. So there you go, a video which goes over quite a few people, interpretations and their ideas. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like, comment and subscribe. Make sure to check out my Patreon if you're interested in donating towards the channel. Any kind of donation really helps out. With that said, thanks for watching. I wish you all the best with the start of the new year. I hope you all are having a great time with the people you love and that you are doing what you want to do. I wish you great vitality into what will be 2021. With that said, thanks for everything and I will speak to you in the next video.